The mechanic was an ordinary man who woke each morning to the smell of oil and the sound of hammers ringing against steel. His hands were calloused from years of bending wrenches and welding sparks. His shirt always smelled of smoke and gasoline, and his eyes carried the weight of someone who had lived the same day over and over again, without much change or excitement. His world was simple and small. He fixed broken cars, patched rusted engines, and sometimes stayed late into the night because it was easier to listen to the hum of machines than the silence of his empty home. He thought nothing could ever shake this rhythm until the evening she arrived. She came not like a customer who wandered in for service, but like a storm that had chosen its path. Her steps were soft but firm, her figure tall and graceful, her presence impossible to ignore. The mechanic looked up from under the hood of a car and for a moment forgot the words he had meant to say because her eyes caught him off guard. They glowed faintly like coals in a dying fire, yet they were alive and restless, as if something ancient stirred inside them. She did not speak right away. She set a strange machine on the counter, a contraption made of silver and dark metal, shaped in ways the mechanic had never seen. Its gears curved like spirals, its edges etched with markings that looked more like scars than carvings. He wiped his hands on a rag and asked what it was, but she only smiled with a softness that unsettled him and said that it needed fixing. He leaned closer, studying the object, his tools heavy in his pockets, ready to work. Yet as his fingers brushed the surface, he felt a vibration, as though the machine itself breathed. He pulled his hand back quickly, blinking in disbelief. He was no stranger to broken engines or malfunctioning circuits, but nothing he had ever touched felt alive. This was no ordinary device, and for the first time in years he felt curiosity burn hotter than fear. The woman watched him carefully, her head tilted as though she were measuring every flicker of his reaction. Her expression, calm, yet her eyes told a different story. Something sharp and knowing, something that carried danger. He forced a laugh, saying he had fixed many strange things, but never one like this. She answered with a voice smooth and deep, saying she had traveled far to bring it to him, because only someone with steady hands and an unshaken heart could mend what others dared not touch. The mechanic wanted to ask questions, but the words dissolved on his tongue. He felt as though he stood at the edge of something vast and unseen, as though the walls of his little garage could no longer hold back the truth of the world beyond. And as he looked at her, once more he realized that she was no ordinary woman. She carried an aura that bent the air around her like heat rising from flames, and though he could not yet name it, he knew his life would never be the same again. She returned the very next evening, just as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in red and gold. The mechanic had not stopped thinking of her or the strange machine all day. He had worked with trembling focus, tightening bolts and checking wires, but always his thoughts wandered back to her glowing eyes and the way her voice rolled like distant thunder. He told himself she might never return, that she could have been a dream spun by his weary mind. But when he heard the door of his shop creak open, his heart leaped. Before he could hide it this time, she carried another device larger than the first, a frame of copper and steel twisted into unfamiliar shapes, its surface etched with symbols that shimmered faintly in the dim light. He cleared his throat, asking where she found such things, but again she only smiled and told him it was not his task to ask questions, but to repair what was broken. He did not argue, for something in her tone left no space for challenge, yet his hands shook slightly as he lifted the machine onto the workbench, feeling once again that same humming pulse that made him believe the device was alive. She did not stand still while he worked. She moved around the garage, slowly running her fingers across the tools and shelves as if she were tracing history in the dust. Her presence filled every corner, and the mechanic felt small under her gaze, though she never judged him openly. Still, it was as though she could see straight through his ribs to the rhythm of his heart. He wiped sweat from his brow, trying to steady himself, focusing on the stubborn wires before him, but each time he glanced up she was watching him quietly, her eyes carrying secrets too heavy for words. When the silence stretched too long, he finally asked who she really was, not in anger but in curiosity, his voice soft as if he were afraid of scaring away a bird. She tilted her head, and for a fleeting moment he thought she might tell him, but instead she leaned closer and whispered that the truth was not ready to be carried by his world. Her words stirred something deep inside him, and though they left him unsatisfied, he found himself more drawn to her than before. Over the weeks she came again and again, always with stranger machines, always with the same request: fix this, mend that. Each time he told himself he would demand answers, yet each time her presence disarmed him, and he found himself surrendering to the mystery and the comfort of her return. He began to wait for her more than he waited for customers. He stayed late in the garage not because of unfinished work but because he hoped to hear the creak of the door and the sound of her steps. The mechanic did not understand what bound him to her, but he knew she was measuring him, testing his patience and his courage with each visit, as though every machine she brought carried not only broken parts, but questions of his worth. He began to realize that she was not simply a customer but a storm, moving slowly closer to the center of his life, and though he had no name for her power, he sensed that he was being drawn into a story far greater than his own. The visits of the strange woman became the rhythm of his days, until the mechanic no longer marked time by the jobs he finished or the customers who passed through his door, but by the moments she arrived carrying those impossible machines, each more complex than the last. He found himself listening for the faint knock on the garage door, or the sound of her voice, greeting him with quiet certainty. Her presence became the one bright thread, weaving through the endless hours of smoke and grease, and for the first time in years he felt alive. She studied him with patience. Each time he worked she stood close, but never to close her eyes, following every flicker of his movements, as if his skill with a wrench revealed something about his soul. He wondered if she was judging him, or simply learning him piece by piece. Her gaze was heavy and strange, yet it was not cruel. In her silence he sensed curiosity, and maybe even trust, and he found himself wanting to be worthy of it. One night, after repairing a device unlike any engine he had known, he asked why she never took her machines elsewhere. Surely there must be others more skilled than a small-town mechanic with second-hand tools. Her answer was calm but absolute. She said there were none with hands as steady as his, and none who carried fire in their hearts, though he did not yet know it himself. Her words sent a chill through him, though he laughed it off, pretending she had meant nothing deeper. Yet the more she came, the more he longed for her return, and the more restless he grew in her absence. When she smiled, his chest felt too small. When she left, he walked the garage like a ghost. He was a man of machines and metal, yet he had never known such a pull toward another soul. He told himself it was foolish that she was a stranger cloaked in secrets, but still he dreamed of her every night, and woke with her name unspoken on his lips. The townsfolk began to notice his distraction. They teased him, saying he must have found a new love. Though none had ever seen her, he brushed off their questions with awkward jokes, but in truth he carried her presence like a hidden flame within him. Even the machines seemed to hum differently when she was near, as though her energy bled into the air and made every spark brighter. One evening, as he worked late, she stayed longer than usual, watching him in silence. When he finally set down his tools and looked at her directly, he felt the weight of something unsaid pressing between them. She stepped closer, her expression softer than he had ever seen, and for the first time she reached out her hand, not for a machine but for his rough, stained fingers. Her touch was warm, not like human warmth but like embers beneath ash, steady and alive. He froze, unable to breathe, as she whispered that he was ready, though he did not yet know what forth. Mechanic did not understand her words, but in that moment he no longer cared. He only knew that whatever secret she carried was about to spill into his life, and he would not turn away. He could not. The night of her revelation was not like the others, for she arrived without a machine in her arms, and the mechanic felt the change before she even stepped inside. The air was heavy, as though a storm was gathering above the garage. Though the sky outside was clear, she closed the door behind her, with slow, deliberate motion, and stood watching him, her eyes brighter than ever. He set down his wrench, waiting for her to speak, his chest tight, with a sense that something irreversible was about to be said. She told him that what she carried could no longer be hidden, not if he was to remain by her side. She said there were truths greater than the machines he repaired, truths older than his town, and older even than the bones of the mountains surrounding them. Her voice shook the air, not with volume but with weight, and the mechanic listened, frozen, the rag in his hand forgotten. He wanted to laugh at his nerves but could not, for her gaze burned straight through him without warning her. Shape began to shift, her outlines stretching as though her body were too small to contain what lived inside her. The mechanic stumbled back against the workbench, eyes wide as wings of shadow spread across the walls, horns curved upward from her brow. Her skin shimmered as though scales rippled beneath the surface. Her face, still partly human but her essence now unmistakable. She was not only a woman, she was dragonborn, and in her presence he felt as though the world had been ripped open. The mechanic should have run. Any ordinary man would have fled into the night and never returned, but his legs refused. to move, and instead he stared at her in awe, his fear rising like smoke in his lungs, yet tangled with wonder. She looked both terrifying and beautiful, her form glowing like fire caged in flesh, her wings folding close once more until she seemed smaller again. Her voice softened as she told him this was her truth, and if he wished to remain with her he must accept. I swallowed hard, his mind racing faster than any engine he had ever built, but even through his confusion one thought burned clear. She had trusted him with her secret, something no one else had seen, perhaps something no one else had survived to see, and he could not betray that trust. He wiped his palms against his trousers, forcing his voice steady though his heart thundered. He told her that every machine he ever fixed had secrets, and perhaps she was only the most complicated one he had ever encountered. She stared at him as if testing whether his courage was genuine. Then at last her lips curved into a rare smile, her eyes no longer sharp, but softened with something close to relief, for in that moment she saw that he would not flee. She stepped closer, folding away the last of her monstrous shadow until she stood as woman once more, her hand lifting to rest lightly against his cheek, her touch both tender and fierce. The mechanic felt the fire of her truth burning against his skin, and though fear still gnawed at him, he knew that turning away was no longer possible. His life was bound to hers, and the path ahead would not belong to machines or ordinary men, but to something far greater than either of them could have imagined. The mechanic did not sleep that night, his mind too restless, his hands trembling. Long after the dragon woman left, he sat in his workshop staring at the tools scattered across the bench, the smell of oil thick in the air. But for once, the machines gave him no comfort. He replayed the sight of her wings spreading wide, the shimmer of scales beneath her skin, the weight of her voice as she spoke truths no ordinary man should ever hear. He wondered if perhaps he had gone mad, yet the warmth of her hand on his cheek still lingered, and he knew it was real when she returned at dawn. Her steps were quiet, but her presence filled the garage like a blaze. He rose quickly, his exhaustion forgotten, though his stomach knotted with questions. She did not bring a machine. This time she carried only her own solemn expression, her eyes glowing brighter than the day before. She told him he had seen her truth, and he had not fled, and for that he had passed the first trial. But there was another greater than the first, a trial not of one man and one woman, but of him against her entire bloodline. The mechanic listened, his chest tightening as she explained that her clan did not forgive love between dragon and human. They considered such bonds betrayal and weakness. If they discovered what she had chosen, they would demand his life to cleanse the dishonor. Yet she had made her decision, and tomorrow he would stand before them. He would not face them as a warrior nor as a mechanic, but simply as himself, and if he faltered he would burn not only in their judgment but in their fire. He wanted to laugh it away, to call it madness, yet he saw no jest in her gaze. The warning was real and sharp as the edge of a blade. He asked what chance a man of grease and steel had before creatures as old as storms. She told him that strength was not measured in scales or flame, but in the courage to stand even when standing meant death. She said the clan would not test his hands, they would test his spirit, and he must hide his fear, for dragons could smell it in every breath. The mechanic felt fear coiled tight inside him, yet beneath it was something stronger, a spark he did not recognize, perhaps born the first moment she had walked into his life. He nodded, though his throat was dry, telling her he would not run, he would face whatever came, because if he could tame the chaos of machines, he could tame his own trembling heart. She studied him for a long moment, then finally let her stern mask soften. With a voice low as embers, she told him she believed in him, though the path ahead was darker than he could yet imagine. That night the mechanic stayed awake in his garage, sparks flying, as he welded not metal but resolve, his mind sharper than the tools in his hands. He whispered to himself that if his love was true, he would endure whatever judgment awaited him. At dawn, outside the night was silent, but he knew the sky was waiting to open with wings and fire, and he was ready, or at least he told himself he was. The mechanic worked through the night, though not on any engine or frame. He knew well he worked instead on himself, his thoughts sparking brighter than the welding torch, his breath heavy with determination. He sat at the bench, surrounded by scattered gears and wires, but the machine before him was his courage, a machine built not with bolts and metal but with steady resolve. He reminded himself that every problem had a solution, every broken thing could be mended, even fear, though its pieces were invisible, could still be shaped and repaired. He thought of her eyes, glowing like fire hidden under the surface of water, and he thought of the way Her hand had pressed against his cheek, as if anchoring him to something larger than his small world. He thought of her warning, and of the fire of her clan waiting to judge him. He felt fear grip his chest like a vice, but he hammered against it, with memories of his own battles with poverty, with loneliness, with days when the world had seemed empty and gray. If he had survived those storms, perhaps he could stand before Drapensta. Hours stretched endlessly. He picked up tools, not to fix her strange machines but to calm his mind. The sound of metal on metal steadied him. Sparks flew as he practiced cuts and welds, each flash like lightning, reminding him that fire was nothing to fear, for he had lived with fire all his life. Fire was his companion in the forge. Fire was the heart of every engine he built. If dragons breathed fire, then he too carried a kind of flame. His flame was made of steel and sweat and will. He caught himself speaking aloud as though giving instructions to an unseen apprentice. He said to himself, "Hold steady, keep your grip, do not falter." He repeated these words over and over, until they echoed in his chest as a mantra. He imagined standing before the clan, their eyes glowing like suns, their wings shaking the earth. He imagined his knees weakening and his body begging to fall. Yet, in his vision, he forced himself upright again and again, until, even in his imagination, he no longer bowed toward dawn. He stepped outside the garage into the cold air, the sky pale with the first light of morning. The world was silent except for the faint stir of wind against the trees. He breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the crisp air, telling himself that he belonged in this moment no less than they did. He was human, yes, but humans built machines that flew across the sky. Humans split atoms. Humans carved cities from stone and steel. And if dragons wished to see weakness in him, they would have to look deeper than his trembling hands. When he returned inside, the dragon woman was waiting, her figure framed by the light of the rising sun. She studied him carefully, her eyes soft yet unblinking. He told her simply that he was ready, though his voice cracked, and though part of him still quaked within. She nodded once, as if she had expected nothing less, and her expression carried a flicker of pride mixed with sorrow, for she knew what awaited them both. Morning rose clear and sharp as the dragon woman led the mechanic away from the town, her stride steady, her presence commanding. The forests seemed to bend around her, as if even the trees knew what walked among them. The mechanic followed close behind, his boots crunching over stone and soil, his heart thundering with every step. He had told her he was ready, yet each mile deeper into the wilderness peeled away another layer of that resolve. Still, he kept moving, for to stop was to surrender, and surrender was death. The path twisted through cliffs and ravines, the air cooler as they climbed higher. The mechanic glanced often at her profile, her calm, unshaken face, her eyes glowing faintly. Even in daylight, he wondered how long she had lived, carrying such a secret among humans, how often she had hidden her fire behind quiet words and gentle smiles. He felt honored she had chosen him, but that honor was also a weight, pressing against his chest, heavier than the pack on his back. Hours passed, until the air grew thin and the valley revealed itself hidden between jagged peaks, clouds curling around its rim like a crown. The mechanic halted, his breath stolen by the sight before him. Shadows moved across the ground, vast and slow, wings beating against the sky, each shape larger than any creature he had ever imagined. Dragons of every color and size circling above the valley floor, their roars rolling like thunder over the mountains. The ground trembled beneath his boots with each beat of their wings. The dragon woman placed her hand on his arm, steadying him as his knees threatened to buckle. She told him softly that this was the heart of her people, a place no human had entered for generations and lived. He swallowed hard, the air thick with smoke and heat. Though no fire burned nearby, he wanted to run. Every instinct in him screamed to turn back. Yet her touch anchored him, and he forced his legs to move. When she stepped forward, they descended into the valley, and the dragons turned their eyes upon them one by one, their gazes piercing like blades of flame. The mechanic felt stripped bare, as though every fear, every doubt, every weakness within him had been dragged into the open. He clenched his fists at his sides, refusing to show the trembling in his bones. He remembered her words, "Hide your fear, for they must see your strength." And though his heart rattled like loose metal, he locked his face into calmness. The dragons landed around them, their claws carving into stone, wings folding with terrible grace. Their scales shimmered like jewels, yet their presence was heavier than mountains, each one watching in silence, their eyes glowing like suns. The mechanic stood small among them, a man of flesh and oil and sweat, yet still standing. The dragon woman stepped closer to him, whispering that the trial had begun, and that every breath from this moment forward was a measure of his worth. The Valley was silent except for the low hiss of smoke rising from the nostrils of the dragons. Their eyes locked on the mechanic with an intensity that made his skin prickle, as if every nerve in his body had been exposed. He felt their judgment before a word was spoken, and it weighed on him like an iron chain. The circle of wings and scales closed tighter around him, their shadows stretching long across the ground until he seemed swallowed by night, though the sun still burned high. Above, the dragon woman stood at his side, her posture proud, her gaze unflinching. Though the mechanic sensed the strain in her voice when she called out to the clan, she declared that she had chosen him, and that her choice was bound by fire and heart, not by weakness. She said he had seen her true form, and had not run, that his courage was proof enough. But her words did not soften their eyes. The dragons growled. Low, a rumble that shook the valley floor. One stepped forward, larger than the rest, scales dark as iron, eyes burning like molten gold, its wings spread wide as if to block out the sky. It lowered its head toward the mechanic, its breath hot and heavy, washing over him with the stench of smoke and ash. It asked in a voice deep as an earthquake what strength he carried that made him worthy to stand among them. The mechanic froze, his throat dry, his knees shaking, yet he remembered her warning that fear would betray him. He drew a breath, slow and steady, though his chest ached, and he answered not with boasts of power, but with truth. He said he was no warrior and no sorcerer. He said he was a man of machines who built with his hands and stood by his word. He said that fear lived in him, as it did in all men, but courage lived beside it, and courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep standing even when every bone wished to fall. The valley echoed with his voice, though it cracked under the weight of honesty. The dragons stared in silence. The great iron-scaled beast, narrowing its golden eyes, smoke curling from its jaws. The mechanic braced for fire, braced for death, yet none came. Another dragon stepped forward, this one silver and sleek, its wings shining like mirrors. It steadied him with piercing eyes, then asked why he stood by the dragon woman. Knowing the price of such love, he looked at her, then back at them, and he said that he stood by her because his heart had chosen her, as surely as steel bends to flame, and that to walk away now would be to live without meaning. A murmur rippled through the gathered clan, low growls blending with roars like distant thunder, their eyes shifting from scorn to something more curious. The mechanic felt the air stir as if a storm was breaking above them. He did not know if he had swayed them or sealed his doom, but he remained upright, his shoulders squared, his fists steady, and though fire danced in the eyes of the dragons, he no longer bowed to it. Silence in the valley stretched long and heavy as the mechanics stood among the circle of dragons, their eyes glowing brighter than the sun above. The air was thick with heat and tension, as though the world itself held its breath. The iron-scaled beast leaned closer, its jaw opening just enough for flame to flicker along its teeth. The mechanic felt the heat on his skin, yet he did not move. He clenched his fists and remembered the words she had whispered, "Hide your fear, for they must see your strength at last." The great beast spoke, its voice rolling across the valley like thunder. It said that men were fragile, things quick to break, quick to betray. It said humans chased power but did not understand it, and for that reason they could never walk beside dragons. The mechanic listened, his body stiff with dread, but he did not turn away. Instead, he lifted his head and said that perhaps men were fragile, yes, but fragility did not mean weakness. He said that steel was brittle until it was forged in fire, and he too had been forged by hardship, by loss, by endless days of struggle and survival. The silver dragon regarded him with unblinking eyes, then turned its gaze to the dragon woman, asking if she would truly bind her fate to this mechanic, knowing the wrath of her kin. She stepped forward, her chin high, her voice clear, as she declared that her choice was already made, that her fire belonged to him as surely as her wings belonged to the sky. Her words rang sharp through the valley, cutting deeper than any flame, and for a moment, even the dragons fell into silence. The mechanic felt his heart pound against his ribs as the circle closed tighter. He expected death, he expected fire, yet something shifted. The dragons drew back their wings, unfurling like sails in a storm, their growls echoing but not in rage. This time, in recognition, the iron-scaled beast reared back its roar, shaking the mountains, its fire bursting into the sky, not to burn him but to mark the moment in flame. It declared that though he was human, his spirit had not bent, his fear had not ruled him. And so he would live. The valley erupted with the roars of the clan, their voices rolling together like 1,000 storms. The mechanic stood trembling but alive. The dragon woman reached for his hand, her grip firm, Her eyes burning with both pride and relief, he turned to her, unable to speak, yet everything he felt poured into the way he held her, the way he stood unbroken beside her, in the heart of fire. The dragons lifted into the sky one by one, their wings blotting out the sun, until the valley darkened beneath them, yet no flame touched him, no claw struck him. The judgment had been passed, and he had endured. The mechanic breathed deep, the smoke-filled air tasting of ash and victory. He knew the path ahead would not be easy. He knew trust would take years to earn, and danger would follow them. But he also knew he was no longer only a man of machines. He was a man who had faced dragons and lived on with the dragon woman at his side. He walked out of the valley not as prey, not as trespasser, but as something new, forged in fire and bound by love.